Why should our soldiers be fighting radicals in a civil war in Afghanistan? We've got our own on Capitol Hill.
It's an unbelievable statement right there. If you can draw the parallel between enemies abroad and enemies at home, you can treat enemies at home as we treated enemies abroad. This is dangerous stuff. For many on the left, they're happy that we are redirecting all of our focus from enemies abroad to enemies within. This is a serious, serious problem. There are a lot of people on the left who are far more concerned with the enemies within than with the enemies abroad. This is why you saw the spectacle of General Mark Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying to Congress that he was deeply, deeply concerned about the roots of white rage. He had to have his soldiers learn. They had to read Ibram X. Kendi to learn about critical race theory and the roots of white rage. We definitely needed that. We needed Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, talking about how we needed to diversify the military. This was a key priority. The wokeification of the military. This was key. Not actually winning wars. By the way, who's going to get fired for this? Anybody? Bueller? No one's going to get fired for this. If you were this incompetent at your job, you'd be fired forthwith, like within seconds. And these jackasses have made a mockery, like an absolute mockery of the sacrifices of the brave men and women of the American Armed Services who sacrificed, in many cases, in thousands of cases, their lives, in tens of thousands of cases, their body parts, their livelihoods, their mental health, in order to establish American security on the ground in Afghanistan and provide us a base to fight terrorism from. And yes, to add to the humanitarian values that were in Afghanistan. Right? Those people have been abjectly betrayed by this administration. I'm getting letters from them all day long, the last several days. Okay, and this administration, they were focused in on what really mattered. And that was the threat of white supremacy within. That was the threat of domestic terrorism in the United States. Okay, so there are bad people in the United States. They exist. But the incredible conflation, like the left knows what's happening here. They do. The hard left understand that what they've just done is humiliate themselves globally. Like really humiliate themselves. That's what this represents. And so they have to come up with an alternative narrative. And the alternative narrative is that the Taliban, yeah, they're bad, but we've got bad people here too. The Taliban are really bad. But you know what? We have an American Taliban we need to fight. We need to bring those soldiers home. Not to, as so many on the right seem to think, send them to the border or redeploy them to the South China Sea. No, the left would like to bring everybody home, focus all of our resources internally. And this is also true with our moral capital. It used to be the United States exported its moral capital. Right? We had all this moral capital. We were the most free country, most powerful country in the history of the world. In the history of the world. The most tolerant and diverse country in the history of the world, by the way, also. And we were exporting that moral capital abroad. Sometimes to great effect, sometimes to no effect. And sometimes to help build nascent democracy in places like Iraq. And yes, at the beginning in Afghanistan. Or maybe we were doing it unsuccessfully in Afghanistan, but successfully in Germany and Japan. Right? The United States has a long history of exporting our moral capital elsewhere. But now, because the left has decided we have no moral capital, instead, we have to take all of our resources. We have to stop interfering in world affairs. We have to let our enemies take advantage of the vacuum that we create. We have to focus all of our moral resources at home. We have to rebuild our moral capital, and rebuilding that moral capital starts at home. We have to make sure that all of our public school students learn about their white privilege. We have to ensure that America sees its dire history of racism, sexism, bigotry, and homophobia. We have to rebuild morally speaking. And that means taking on the real enemy. The real enemy is not tens of thousands of miles away. The real enemy is not in Afghanistan. The real enemy is not terrorists or China. The real enemy is here within. That's the enemy that we have to fight, according to members of the hard left. So you have the specter of Stephen Colbert. This is unbelievable. Likening Trump voters to the Taliban. This happened 2 nights ago.
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
He's right. We've had troops there for 20 years. They fought. They sacrificed. Their families sacrificed so that we wouldn't have a terrorist attack in America planned in a foreign country. Why should our soldiers be fighting radicals in a civil war in Afghanistan? We've got our own on Capitol Hill.
We've got our own on Capitol Hill. You see the people who are outside the Capitol. That was what that picture was. The people who are outside the Capitol building on January 6th, they are the same as the American Taliban. They are just the same thing. They're the same. Oh, are they now? Fascinating. So if that were the case, and by the way, that's what he wants, right? The idea is that we have to redeploy the American military against people who disagree with Stephen Colbert. That's It's an unbelievable statement right there. Okay, so by the way, even in that statement, he acknowledges why we were supposed to remain in Afghanistan, to fight terrorism, because guess what? That threat has not ended, and now it's going to be reconstituted in Afghanistan. But that's a side point. For the radical left, the enemy is not the Taliban. Those are people who are very far away, engaged in a civil war. The enemy is you. The enemy is people who think like you, who disagree with Stephen Colbert. He doesn't mean that we need the American military there to put down actual violent action only at the Capitol building. No, far from it. The left conflates all those people you see. The left is not interested in separating off the people who engaged in violent activity and who were duly arrested at the Capitol building. The left believes that everyone who is outside the Capitol is the same as everybody who actually violated the law. They believe that everybody who voted for Donald Trump is the same as the people outside the Capitol. Right? This is what the left does. We have violent terrorists in the United States. By the way, you know what happened with that? You know how many people were actually murdered on that day? Okay, the answer is that no actual people were murdered on that day. The only person who was actually killed on that day, as in actively killed on that day, was Ashley Babbitt, who was one of the protesters, one of the rioters, right? She was engaging in criminal activity. And the entire place was cleared within 3 hours, and the government went on. So if that sounds a lot like the Taliban to you, it's because you're a crazy person. It's because you're out of your damned mind. There are also gradations of people doing bad things and believing terrible things. Okay, the people who invaded the Capitol building in the belief that the election was illegitimate are not remotely on the level of human beings in Afghanistan who wish to crowd women back into basements, keep them there as sex slaves for decades on end, make sure they can't go to school, make sure that everybody lives under the most brutal and violent form of Sharia law. Like, can we make any sort of gradations here? Can we say that even if we think that the January 6th riots were an act of evil, that is a different level of evil than people who are literally living in Stone Age barbarism and murdering people in order to ensure that Stone Age barbarism rules? Are there no gradations here at all? According to the left, there aren't. And in fact, the people in the United States who did this are much more dangerous to us than the Taliban. They're much more dangerous, because 9/11 never happened, you see. 9/11 was a figment of your imagination. 9/11, in fact, what happened on January 6th is worse than 9/11 in the minds of the left, because it came from here, even though it resulted, again, in no murders. That is not to downplay the evil of that, but to the comparison to 9/11 itself is idiotic. But to the left, it's worse. It's worse than 9/11. 9/11 basically never happened, according to the left. So we don't have to worry about threats abroad anymore. Those are done, according to Stephen Colbert. The real threat is you. The real threat is people who think like you. And by the way, if you don't think that they are conflating everybody, if you think that Colbert is just talking about the rioters, you're wrong. Malcolm Nance, who you'll recall I debated on Bill Maher, and I pointed out that Malcolm Nance has a really, really nasty habit of conflating the people who engaged in criminal activity on January 6th with everyone who voted for Trump. Now Malcolm Nance has a new theory. His theory is that Trump voters everywhere are going to engage in an actual violent civil war, which would explain why we need to pull out from Afghanistan to activate against those people. Here's Malcolm Nance doing what he does most often, which is claim that he has inside intelligence information suggesting that a massive civil war is about to break out in the United States, led by Trump.
These guys view themselves as this fanciful group of patriotic freedom fighters, the second coming of the Sons of Liberty. And there are many of them who are preparing for civil war right now. All the shame that we tried to give them after January 6th, that's gone. There are many of them right now that are ready to fight. And we're seeing politicians in the state houses and the Capitol who are actually, pushing them subliminally to fight.
This doltish clod, here's what he had to say right before that. Quote, "The Republican Party is more like Sinn Féin, and the relationship between Sinn Féin, the Irish Nationalist Party, and the Irish Republican Army, Provisional Irish Republican Army terrorist group, who call themselves freedom fighters and insurgents, and had American congressmen, sending them money to buy, heavy machine guns." Okay, so the idea here, again, from the left, increasingly, is that the Taliban are not bad, right? Or at least they're not really a threat. Maybe they're not great, but really, should we worry about them? The real threat is everyone who voted Republican, everyone who voted Trump. Those people are the real threat. Those are the people we deeply have to worry about. Michael Moore made this absolutely clear. So Michael Moore is a complete buffoon. He tweeted out, "They're Taliban, our Taliban. Everybody's got a Taliban. They're at their best when they confiscate the halls of power." And then he tweeted a picture of the Taliban sitting at the seat of the national government, and then the buffoonish idiots who invaded the Capitol building on January 6th. You will note that the people in the upper picture, the Taliban, they're going to murder probably tens of thousands of human beings. They're also going to retain this dictatorship until presumably the end of time. And the people at the bottom are a bunch of clods in buffalo hats who were cleared out of the Capitol and arrested within 3 hours. Those are not comparable. Those are not remotely comparable. But if you can draw the parallel, the left has been doing this for 20 years, by the way, but now it's really kicked into high gear since Trump. If you can draw the parallel between enemies abroad and enemies at home, you can treat enemies at home as we treated enemies abroad. This is dangerous stuff. This is dangerous stuff. Because for members of the radical left and increasingly the mainstream left, if the idea is we rebuild moral capital by destroying the enemies here at home, this is how tyranny happens. This is how authoritarianism happens. If you are justified in treating, after all, we literally fought the Taliban. We unleashed the drones on them. We've probably killed tens of thousands of members of the Taliban over the years. If there's an equivalent group in the United States to the Taliban, we would have to treat them like we treated the Taliban, would we not? Members of the left are eager and happy about that, of the hard left. If that sentiment grows, that really is a threat to the future of the country on a broad scale. But we have many threats to the future of the country. We have the radicals on the left who think that everybody who disagrees with them is the American Taliban and must be thoroughly destroyed. We have a group of people on the left who believe that government ought to rule all of our lives on the basis of the slimmest and thinnest of reeds, like at this point, the COVID pandemic. We have people on the left who believe that the pathway back to American moral capital is to completely destroy the American economic system by burdening it with the greatest spending binge in the history of anything, and to destroy America's credibility on the foreign stage. Decline is a choice. The left is choosing it. The battle for the culture is heating up. We here at the Daily Wire are making some big moves. So be sure to like, subscribe, ring that bell, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment.